Hello and welcome everyone to Job Search for the Mature Worker. My name is Nick and I'll be your instructor for this recording. So without further ado, let's just get right into things. So for our agenda today, we'll be talking about a lot of different topics, kind of a smorgasbord of everything relating to the job search and applications, if you will. But more specifically in a context, what are we talking about? First and foremost, we're going to learn how to find, apply, and interview for jobs using all of today's tools such as Indeed.com, to name a really popular one out there. We'll also talk about how the interview and hiring processes have changed, whether it's been 2 years or 2 months or 20 years since you last did any of this stuff. We'll talk about general tips, how we can stand out from other applicants, particularly when it comes to things like resumes and interviews. And lastly, how can we showcase our value to employers? How can we let an employer know that we do have the skills and abilities that we have? And also, on another note, how can we showcase this value to ourselves? I know from 9 months of personal experience how sometimes draining a job search can be when nothing seems to land. And it's, you kind of get down on yourself and you get in this Ouroboros way of thinking, or you're constantly going in this cycle of saying, I don't have a job, I'm not getting interviews because I have no skills or whatever. And we really need to find a way to break that cycle and understand that we do have skills and value to offer employers. We just have to find good ways of presenting that value when it comes to those employers. So I won't really talk about that last bullet point in specific during this workshop. I really just wanted to be set out there so you can think about that in the back of your mind. Hopefully by the end of this workshop, you really have a lot to think about. What value I do have, what value do you have when it comes to everything we'll talk about today. So I'm sure this is a question that's on your mind considering the topic of today's workshop, but it really is a silly question, as the answer is there isn't a lot of difference. It just comes down to updating your job searching skills. Skills like resume writing and interviewing, even applications in their own right, are not things like riding a bike. They're not skills that you can just pick up and do, off the top of a hat. They are things that you need to maintain if you want to continually be good at them. And if not maintaining them, if you don't need them, you need to relearn them in many cases. Because in many cases, like in the case of this workshop, sometimes the skills may have changed or may have different approaches to using them. So it is really important to recognize that difference between it's not you, it's just a matter of those skills that you have need to be updated. So let's take a look at the landscape of today's job search. So first and foremost, one of the more obvious things is that online job applications are the norm. Very few places are going to have paper applications. The few places I can think of are places like restaurants or grocery stores, sometimes hotels, smaller stores, family-owned businesses, so on and so forth. Most of the places that you'll be applying to will be through sites like Indeed or Monster. Probably Indeed in more so cases, as it's the more popular out of the two, or other websites. And I'll just rattle a few off here, such as ZipRecruiter or Glassdoor or anything of that nature. And a big part of that, speaking of Glassdoor, when it comes to these online applications, is the question of salary. Usually that salary question nowadays is on the application itself. What are your salary requirements? And it's a question that we really want to answer in specific. We really want to give employers a good idea of what salary we're looking for, because if we don't do that, if maybe we put something like negotiable in there, it could make employers a little nervous. Maybe they're thinking that we want a salary that's, way higher than they can possibly pay us. They might pass by our application altogether. So you do want to check out some other websites such as Glassdoor, as I mentioned, and Salary.com. Glassdoor.com is very similar to Indeed.com, where it's a job search engine where you can go and find jobs to apply to from all different kinds of employers. But it has a lot more information when it comes to salary and industry information that's going to be very, very helpful when it comes to doing your salary research. A great first step in that salary research bit there. Salary.com is more specific on salary. Little interesting website here. It's something that I've used quite a bit in my time ever since I was in college. It's something that I was introduced to back then, and it's really great because it makes it so you can look up the kind of position you're looking for and the area that you're looking for, and you can get more specific with the salary, because it's going to have all these questions on there that are filter questions on how to how do different factors affect your salary? So ask you about your education level, your years of experience in that field, at whatever job you're looking at, who you may report to in a general hierarchy. So a whole lot of different questions that will affect that salary. So I do highly, highly recommend looking into all 4 of these websites, but even salary.com in particular, if you want more information about how to denote your salary. Another big step is something that I may have already mentioned a little bit, is that the hiring process is much more candidate-centric. Employers know that they don't want to lose any good candidates coming through their pipelines, whether they're in the earlier stages or the latter stages. So they know they want to keep those people engaged and informed, because otherwise they may start to look elsewhere or just may lose interest in that job because they're just not simply hearing about this. I'm sure we've all been in that situation at least once, where maybe we had a phone call or even an interview with an employer, and it seemed like after that we were left out in limbo. And so employers, generally speaking, know to not do this anymore. Certainly we may still run into this here and there, but employers, generally speaking, do know that they want to keep their job candidates engaged and informed. And this mindset of the hiring process has led to different, quicker, more convenient ways of interviewing. And some of the interviewing forms are things like phone interviews, probably the most common interview type that come out of this thought process. Many, if not all, almost all interviews nowadays, or interview processes, I should say, start with something like a phone interview or a phone screening. Whether that's a quick, 20-minute call or a whole 45 minutes on the phone with someone, where you're answering questions for them. And it could be a lot of different things out there. And typically this will be an earlier interview or earlier step in the interview process. It in most cases won't be something where it's toward the end of the interview process. It's usually just to go over your resume and your interest in the company in general. Another form of interviews that have happened is something called the pre-recorded interview. So this is not as common nowadays, but still very common, or gaining popularity, I should say, where a company will actually send you a link to a program, and the program will ask questions of you, and you actually have to record your answers either by audio or audio and visual. And it's a little odd because you're not actually being interviewed by anyone, but you're actually sending essentially a video for the interviewers to watch later and then decide whether they want to bring you in for an actual interview or not. Again, just like the phone interview, this is probably going to be extremely early on in the process, probably even before a phone interview in many cases, because typically the questions they're going to ask you are questions that are very, very simple, very general, questions that can be answered in a couple of minutes at most. And lastly is what I would like to call the Skype interviews. So this is an interview where you are actually talking to someone, but now you're talking to someone over the webcams of your respective computers. And so it is a little different from the other two, because this one is more of a quote-unquote actual interview, although I'd be asking you real, behavioral questions. But it's still something that's typically somewhat early on, probably after a phone interview, but before they decide to bring you in for a real in-person interview. And typically the companies that end up using these kind of interview methods, the Skype interview in this case, are companies that may have a headquarters located outside of the location you're interviewing in. Maybe they want you to meet certain people who work there and don't work locally where you work. So that's not always the case, but that's sometimes the case in my experience as to why these Skype interviews happen. Another big thing with interviews that have changed is that we really need to be able to be good storytellers. Many times when you're in an interview, you get those questions that start out by saying, tell me about a time you did this, tell me about a time you did that, or tell me about a time you failed, tell me about a time you worked on a team, tell me about a time you succeeded. Tell me about a time forces you to tell a story. It's not as black and white with just fill-in-the-blank answers. You need to be able to keep your audience, the interviewer, engaged with what you're talking about. So you really want a lot of results-driven answers in those stories with specific anecdotes from your work experience. And we'll talk about this a little more when we get to the general interview section of this workshop, but just to give you all an idea about what we're going to talk about. Another big thought of the interview process today is the importance of personality and culture. Many times in many interview processes, a personality test is going to be what a lot of employers will use to screen applicants in many cases. And this personality test can be a number of different things where they're asking you to answer a whole lot of different questions, and they don't seem exactly professionally related. They might ask questions, how do you interact at a social setting? Are you, Wallflower, are you the center of attention? And you may seem like, well, why are they asking me these kinds of questions? Well, what they want to do is get at the core of your personality, because many companies not only need someone with the right qualifications, the right resume, the right background, they also need that person to fit with the company. They need to be someone who can work nicely along the coworkers or the other employees they have there, I should say, because they fit the mold of that company, if you will. And a lot of these personality tests are used to relay, how is this personality of this person relate to our mission and our values, something that you all as job seekers really want to pay a lot of attention to. You really want to make sure that you're applying to companies that you can see yourself working for and that you ethically and morally agree with. It may be advantageous to apply to each and every job out there, but you got to make sure that the companies you're applying for are companies that you wholly can agree with and wholly can see yourself working for. And this is where you really want to know yourself as a worker too, and maybe even consider taking one of these personality tests out there, because there's a whole lot of different personality tests you can take online for free that will act in a lot of the same methods. One of the bigger ones is called the Myers-Briggs Type Assessment. And that's actually relating to the picture you're looking at right there, where it has that INFJ real big in the person's head here. The Myers-Briggs Type Assessment is sort of the godfather, if you will, of all the other personality tests. It's the most popular. It's where most people take personality test sort of inspiration from. And essentially what that test does is asks you a lot of those questions. And what they'll do is they'll ask those questions again, but in different wording, to make sure that you're staying consistent with your answers. And once you ask those questions, it gives you a 4-letter code. So for example, my 4-letter code, at least the last time I took the Myers-Briggs, is INFJ. And each of those letters mean I lean a certain way in my personality. So for example, the I, believe it or not, stands for introverted. So generally speaking, I'm a more introverted person than I am an extroverted person. This is a little odd to hear considering my job revolves around public speaking, but it is true, and it's something that is really important for me to consider. I do really enjoy my job, and I do really enjoy public speaking, but I know after every time I teach a class or even just do a workshop like this, I need to settle down for a bit. I need to recharge some of my social batteries to get right back to it. And that's okay, and I know that by myself. I'm able to work with myself in that case when it comes to my personality. So it is really important to take some sort of personality test. I wouldn't say you have to take the entire Myers-Briggs or anything like that, but take some sort of personality test, because you might know if you're more introverted or extroverted or otherwise. But how does that relate to other people? How does that relate to the jobs you want to work? Can you work a job effectively based on your personality? And that's really a question for you to know for yourself when it comes to applying for a lot of these jobs, because maybe you apply for a job that ultimately isn't right for you, and you don't realize that until well after the fact, and now you're working a job where you might be essentially miserable, and it's really just not beneficial for neither you or the employer. And a quote I always like to leave on before I hop off this slide is, technical skills can be taught, but the right outlook can't. Someone can teach you to use an Excel spreadsheet, or to drive a forklift, or to, bandage a wound in a hospital, but they can't teach you to be the right person for that job. They can't change your personality. Certainly you can change your personality, but that won't happen overnight at the drop of a hat. It's going to take some time for those things to happen. Another big area of interest is social media. Certainly social media has changed all aspects of our lives, and the job search, the working world, is certainly affected by that as well. And social media for companies is where they form a lot of their public perception nowadays. Everything we find or think about a company can be found, or at least tied back to, a part of their social media should they be using it. And now, why is that important for us? Well, this is an important research tool for us, because when it comes to social media, a company's culture and values are conveyed. And we just talked about how important it is to have a good understanding of a company's culture and values in relation to our own culture and values. So social media will be like our little window, our research tool into a company's culture, essentially. The way they feel, the way they work, what kind of people work there. It's going to be a great way to see, what kind of things companies are posting and what kind of things they're highlighting about the company. And that can give us an idea as if that company is going to be right for us. And if it is, it's going to be a great way for us to research. So use, their Facebook or their LinkedIn or even their Twitter, Instagram, YouTube accounts, any of those social media sites you might have a passing familiarity with. Look into those things if you can and see how they use social media to their benefit. One thing I always say is that the online company needs to match the actual company. So you really want to make sure that whenever you are researching for a job and you look at their social media, you want to make sure that that presence, that the idea you get from them by looking at their website and their social media accounts matches what you see when you walk into their doors. You want to make sure they're actually practicing what they preach. And certainly this doesn't have to be an exact one-to-one comparison, as with many larger companies, their regional cultures are going to be different. Even, down to the individual locations could be different. But they should be following their overarching guidelines and their overarching sense of mission. So you really make sure that they're not pulling complete 180 on you, because that's a huge red flag, in my opinion, when it comes to these companies. It's a huge issue if they're not really practicing what they preach. One thing to consider when it comes to social media is that some companies in some industries may not have a huge presence on social media. So where social media is a good tool for public perception, it is also a good recruiting and marketing tool. And if a company doesn't need to market or recruit people, if they have that process down pat, for example, maybe like a smaller company or a company that focuses on a single type of worker, they may not have a need for a lot of social media because those things cost money and people to run them and training and all that stuff that goes into that process there. So do consider what kind of position you're going into, what kind of field you're going into. Is that a type of company that's going to really, go all out on every single social media outlet, or are they going to have, a LinkedIn page at most, or even nothing at that? So keep that in mind. A lack of social media isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's more of a thing that might happen from company to company. And lastly, employers want adaptable and dynamic employees. And this is one I always like to kind of go through in a different way. So this is probably the most important slide out of this entire slide deck. And something that you really want to be able to convey to an interviewer, say that I can be adaptable, I can be dynamic, I want to learn new things, I want to challenge myself, I really want to, go at it all with this new position or this new company. Because think of the idea of presentation when it comes to an interview. An interview, in many cases, is like an audition. You really have to put all, cylinders firing in that interview, because that interviewer's job is not only to see whether you have the right qualifications, again, the right resume, but as we already discussed, to make sure that you are the right fit for that position. They have to imagine themselves working alongside of you. And if you go into an interview and you're frowning or you're not excited to be there or whatever, in most cases you're not going to get hired. So you really want to think about this aspect of presentation. Let me put it with an analogy. Let's say, obviously not right now, but let's say, for example purposes, you went to a restaurant and you went to a very nice, let's say a steakhouse in this example, and you got their finest steak dinner with all the fixings on the side, and the chef knew you were coming, they were so excited you were coming, and they cooked it perfectly. It's exactly how you wanted it, and it's the best dish that chef has ever cooked in their lives. Let's say they bring that perfect meal out to you, and they serve it to you on a paper bag. How do you feel about that meal then? Probably not as good, because the presentation bit wasn't there. The contents of the meal was fine, but the presentation of the paper bag was not fine. You would expect it to be served on something like a plate. You want to apply that same context, that same idea to something like an interview. You can be the most qualified candidate. You can know all the things the job asks you to do, but if you don't present those things in the right way, the employer it's not going to matter to the employer. So you really want to think about presentation. Give a little more energy than you might usually will. And as someone, again, who is more generally reserved than most people, I know the importance of giving energy. Again, if I, was very monotone this very presentation, if I didn't try to put a little more animation in my voice than I usually do, you might not be as interested in this presentation as you normally do. Usually when I present in front of people, I really try to move around, to interact, to use my hands to display things, whatever it might be, because I know that's what gets people paying attention. It's the same mindset in an interview. So really think about this slide and really take this slide to home, that you really want to show that energy in an interview, because that will really make you the better candidate. So we just talked about some fun things. Let's go on to next talk about some not so fun things. So again, given the topic of the workshop, we do want to go over these things. Unfortunately, ageism is a thing that exists. It's not right, but we do want to address it outright. So what are some negative assumptions that employers might have about a mature worker? Now these, from my slide deck, come from research and come from talks with people in my network, and also from talks from people who have come to this class in the past. I've gotten ideas and things that they see coming up in a lot, and I've added in some of these things over the time. So the first one I think of, coming from my background in HR and recruiting, is that mature workers in many cases are too expensive. They demand higher salary, more benefits. We know that salary is consumable with the amount of experience an individual has, and if someone who might be considered a mature worker has a lot of experience, they might expect more salary. So that's a very big issue a lot of employers might be facing, or assumptions that they might be having for themselves. They might think that mature workers might have traditional mindsets and they're difficult to train. Hence, the whole purpose of the last slide is to show them, dispel that thought right away. Show them that you are not going to have a traditional mindset. You want to learn new things, and you want to learn, new ways of doing the things you already know how to do. And that's something that I think is really, important for you to take home. Is that you do want to open yourself to learning new things and understand that you need to, continually learn to be successful. This one I find very personally silly, that mature workers cannot keep up with the workload. I know my mother is a charge nurse in an ER, and, she is working her heart out right now, but she always does. She runs twice as fast as I do, and, she still keeps up with her workload and all the workload of everyone on her team. So I don't really try to defend or even give any credence to this one in any given way. It is an unfortunate one that a lot of employers tend to see. Another concern is that a mature worker might overlook a younger superior. It is a rational thought to think, would you listen to someone with 10 to 15, 20 years experience with you? Some of you might say yes. Some of you, maybe might have some apprehensions, and that's okay. That's okay to have those thoughts, but you want to remind yourself that everyone has had a different perspective in their lives. Maybe that person who has, less experience than you has covered other areas you even haven't seen yet of that field that you're both in. So maybe it is important to recognize that you can learn from other people. And also to impart that you may be able to teach them as well and help them grow in some case as well. And lastly, that you may leave for a better position. Certainly sometimes when you have an unexpected layoff, or you have to leave a job unexpectedly, you may start looking for an in-between position, because certainly just because you stop working, the bills don't stop coming, and that's certainly understandable. We really want to hope that we're looking into positions, even if they end up being in-between positions, that are positions we can enjoy working in some capacity. It doesn't mean you need to be, busting on the door to your office every day, or to your location every day, I should say, but a job that you can look forward to working in some way, shape, or form. And all these assumptions, even the first and the last one, can be applied to any age group. Many people are saying, the millennial and the Gen Z generations are much more of job hoppers than any other generation has been. They stay at jobs for 3 or 4 or 5 months, and certainly that is true. A lot of college students ask for a higher salary right out of the gate of college, and maybe they don't understand that they can't expect that much money because they don't have the experience to back it up there. So all these things can be applied across the board for any age group. I think these are a little more general than some. There is one assumption that I do find is much more specific to mature workers, and that's the question of overqualifications. In many cases, it may be posed with this question you see on your screen there: aren't you overqualified for this position? Certainly this is a difficult question, and in my opinion, an unfair question in many cases, but we want to look at how we want to answer it, because it might come up in our interviews. First and foremost, we don't want to ignore it. We want to, address it right away. We don't want to beat around the bush. We do want to say, yes, I am blank. But that blank is not going to be overqualified. Overqualified, inherently is not a negative word. However, it has this negative connotation of being negative. And so When you say you're overqualified, you just describe yourself negatively, and we really want to avoid that. So what we want to say is, yes, I am highly qualified. Yes, I am justly qualified. Yes, I bring a lot to the position. We just don't want to say overqualified. I know semantically that may seem silly, but you'll be surprised about the power of language and how that power is there. So you really want to consider using other words other than overqualified when describing and answering this question. Next, again, we want to show that enthusiasm. Enthusiasm and engagement are two words you're going to see a lot throughout this PowerPoint. Because like I mentioned in that slide with the chameleon on it, it is really, really important to show that enthusiasm, to have that presentation about not only the job, but also the company. You know, answer those things in both ways. What makes you excited about the job? What makes you excited about the company? You also want to try to tweak your resume. Now, we'll talk about resume writing in just a few slides here. But what I mean here is that let's say you are going for a position that technically you might be considered overqualified for. You really want to focus on the things from your past work experiences that are more closely aligned with what they're looking for in that position. Because let's say, for example, you were a manager in your past job, and now you're going for something where you're not managing anyone. The fact that you were a manager is definitely helpful and should be brought up at some point in the interview process, but maybe not at the resume point, because when they review resumes, they're looking for resumes that closely match the job description, looking for resumes that are similar to what they're looking for in the job description. So make sure you do match your resume to the language of the job description, really match the details of the job description. You can always talk about all your other skills later on once you have the point of interview. And lastly, make sure you are flexible of your salary, but not too flexible. So we did talk about salary a little bit already, but why am I saying be flexible? Because many times I talk to people and they say that, they are looking for something within the range of what they previously had got in their past jobs, which is something that you definitely should be doing. You should be looking within that idea, within that range of what you got in your past career. But you also want to remind yourself is, with the salary you left with, why did you get that salary? Did you get it right off the gate and you've had that salary the whole time? In most cases, probably not. In most cases, you had a starting salary, or even maybe even started as an hourly worker, or whatever might have happened, and you grew with the company, and you got promotions and raises and all these other things, bonuses, and you end up with a salary here. And now you're essentially starting over with another company. You're not starting over in that field. You certainly do deserve close to that salary because of the experience you have, but now you're starting with a whole new company when you go to apply for a job. So it is important to be flexible with your salary, and this is where research is really going to come into play and really help you better make the decision of what salary would be ultimately appropriate for you. So some other tips and ways to disprove these negative assumptions or dispel these negative assumptions. Again, the first one's going to be engagement. Simply showing them that you're excited to be there and having an amiable face when you're in that interview or talking to someone over the phone is going to be extremely helpful when it comes to these interviews. Next, you also want to highlight your experience. Highlight your varied experience. Try to give a lot of different examples to show that you have, dealt with a lot of different areas. And a way that may be helpful for you is when you're talking about your own stability and productivity. You can tell them you don't need as much training as, someone who has had less experience needs, because you have done this once or twice before. You know some of the problems may keep up. Certainly, again, you're not a master of everything, but you know a lot more than someone who's only been working in this field for, even half the time that you might have been. So really convey that you can get to work sooner and quicker and be more productive because you don't need as much hand-holding as someone else might need. And also, if you are relevant on the up-to-date skills, and this can be everything from technology skills to just general workplace attitudes that you have for your field. Let them know that not only in your resume, but in those phone screenings and interviews as well. Okay, so let's take some of the things and learn more about how we can tackle everything in this job search. First and foremost, let's talk real briefly about resume writing. So we won't actually go through every little last detail about resume writing today. There is the Resume Writing 101 recording to listen to as well if you did want to learn more about that, but just to give you a little snippet of what resume writing is all about. So I have this little Venn diagram here, to display that all resume formats, those three you see in those bubbles there, convey the same information. They all convey work experience and skills, education, so on and so forth. But each format goes about it in a different way. So for example, the chronological resume is the most common type of format where their focus is of work experience. The functional resume is all about skills, and the combination resume does what it says it's going to do and combines them both. But specifically speaking, how does that work? Well, let's take a look at these resume formats. If you're looking at your screen from left to right, it goes chronological, functional, and combination. So let's look at the chronological resume first. We can see that majority of that page space is dedicated solely to the work experience. The skills are on there, but they're relegated more toward the bottom, because when we use this resume, we want to really convey the progression of our work experience first and foremost to the person looking at the sheet of paper or the online document. And this is best used for people who have a pretty stable and consistent job history, meaning little to no gaps. They have worked in the same job or field for the entirety of their career and intend on going back in that field, and they have had some sort of progression throughout their career. And if that resume works for you, that's great. But maybe that isn't the case. Maybe you have had gaps in your career, or absences, or you're coming from one job over the past, entirety of your career. There could be a lot of different situations that would actually, when you're using this resume, would actually deter you or actually, be a detriment to you. So that's where something like the functional resume, that middle resume, may come in. We can see in this resume, the majority of page space is dedicated solely to the skills and qualifications of the individual. And work experience, again, is there, but is not very detailed and has been relegated toward the bottom. This resume is great for people who have had a lot of gaps in their work history or absences, or they worked a lot of different jobs in a lot of different fields and nothing is ever cohesive enough to build into a chronological resume. It could also be helpful for people starting in an entirely new field, and maybe your past work experiences don't really have any or a lot of bearing on the new field you're going into. It could be helpful in that regard as well. And the third resume, the combination resume, looks very, very similar to the first one, the chronological resume. The only notable difference is that now skills has been taken from the bottom and pushed up to the top and expanded upon ever so slightly. The combination resume is one I find that most people tend to cling to, and it is one of my personal favorites. Certainly none of these resume formats will work better than the others per se. It's more so how it works for you. If the combination resume works better for you than the functional resume, then the combination resume you should be going with. But what exactly does the combination resume do? Well, the combination resume is meant to be more adaptable than the other two. Chronological is solely sort of focused on work experience. Functional is solely focused on skills. Combination can combine those two areas. And this is helpful for a lot of people, more specifically those of you who might have worked one job over the past 10 to 15 years. Maybe you're asking yourself, well, I know, or at least I'm about to find out, that I only want to go back the past 10 or 15 odd years on my resume. What can I do if I only have one job from that time period? Well, a combination resume would be your answer, because what you would do in that case is your experience section would consist of that one job, but your skills section would be much, much larger. Because we don't have to write the skills section just with bolded keywords. We can write it with bolded statements the same way we see on the functional resume to the left right there. So think of the combination resume sort of as the adaptable one. Again, if the chronological resume works better for you, use the chronological resume. If the functional resume works better for you, use the functional resume. You don't have to use the combination just because I go on about it. You can use any number of these resumes because they're all going to work best for you based on your experience level. The other big thing to take note is that you don't have to stick to one resume. Many people find that sometimes they can use a functional resume for some jobs, but a combination resume for other jobs. And that is okay. That is a very important thing to recognize. Some resume tips we want to keep in mind is we don't want to date ourselves. We don't want to put anything on there that might cause some of those negative assumptions to come into play well before we even get a chance to do so. So we only want to include the last 10 to 15 years of work experience. And typically when we're asking or talking about work experience, we don't want to say something akin to 25 years experience in blank field. What we want to say is 10 plus or 15 plus years. And that may sound a little oxymoronic to hear, because, why wouldn't I want to convey I've had all this experience in one field? Well, think of it this way. Let's say that I'm a recruiter with that negative age bias in the back of my head, and I see 25 years experience on a resume. The first thing I'm doing with that resume, if I don't feel like hiring older workers, is probably just throwing it out, because I know that that person didn't just get it right out of college. I know that person is a mature worker. So we want to back off of that. The other thing with that as well is that plus sign there that you see next to the 10 or 15. Usually that's a good hook for many recruiters, for many hiring managers. It technically is a way that, it brings them into the resume and they have more questions. They're very interested and they want to call you to have those questions answered. So it's serving two purposes there by shrinking that down to saying, as opposed to 25 years of experience, we're going to say 15 plus years of experience in that case. We don't really need to put down graduation dates, specifically when it comes to your education. Any degrees or licenses you might have gotten in the past, unless they need to be renewed at any given point. Because let's face it, if you have an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree or a license that doesn't need to be renewed, you have those things. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about when you got it. You don't need to put that down, especially if it's been some time since you got that piece of education. We don't want to date ourselves that way either. So avoid putting those dates if it seems overly unnecessary. If you just got your degree last year, it's fine to put a date down. Still, technically, you don't need to, but it's fine in that case. But if it was 20 odd years ago, we probably don't want to put it down there to avoid those ages and bits and pieces there. But one thing I always like to leave off on this slide is that this conversation of age is no way going to be entirely avoided. Because many times in an application, they're going to ask you to fill out the dates of your graduation dates or to give your birthday of all things. And I know they can't ask you for your age, but they can ask you for your date of birth. And if they ask me for my date of birth, well, they can do the math. So just be prepared for that. The resume is something that you can control. You can't control what kind of questions an employer asks you on a job application. So really just make sure you're focusing on a resume, on those things that you can control when it comes to this topic. Next, I'm going to real briefly talk about writing cover letters. I say briefly because the resume class goes over this in a little more detail, and the handout for this class has a lot of information on cover letter writing, including a template and a guide. But just get an idea down. When you're writing a cover letter, what kind of things are going to go into that cover letter? First and foremost, you want to talk about how you found the position, whether you found it on Indeed or you were referred to by a friend of yours who works for the company, whatever it might be. Then you want to talk about your interests. And again, just like in the interview, you want to make this section be very engaging and exciting for the interviewer or hiring manager to read. Really make them feel your excitement and your interest in their company. Then the most specific part of the the cover letter here, is a job-specific anecdote about skills you have from the job description. So what you want to do is look at the job description, read it up and down, and pick out some skills in there that you have. And in the cover letter, you want to write a very specific anecdote about how you have that skill and how you've proven that skill in the past. And I cannot emphasize enough how specific this anecdote should be. It shouldn't be that you have the skill and you've worked with the skill or have used the skill in all 5 of your past jobs or so. Because essentially you're just rewriting your resume when you do that. What you want to do is pick a specific story from your experience. This one time at this company, this happened, this is how I responded with the skill, this was the result of my action there. And be that specific with it, because that's going to give employers a much more real idea about how that skill has played into your work experience. And lastly, make sure you end with a thank you, some contact information, and a hopeful remark regarding, I hope to see you again in the future, I hope to hear from you soon, so on and so forth. But again, I really can't emphasize that how you want to be very, very specific with that skill you're talking about in the cover letter. It should be a specific job anecdote you can talk about. Alright, so let's talk about one of the bigger parts is the interviewing part here. So as we said earlier, what we want to do with interviews is make sure we have those stories that prove our abilities. And every good story has a good beginning, middle, and end as a sort of outline. So why can't these stories have them? Well, we can use a problem action result statement, or a PAR statement for short, to be our little outline. So think of those interview questions where they ask you to say, hey, tell me about a time you overcame an obstacle, just for example. When I get asked that question, I can think to myself, okay, problem action result, PAR. The obstacle is my problem. One time my manager called out on the day of new hire orientation. The action is how I responded to it. I decided to manage new hire orientation in her stead. The result is the result from my action. New hire orientation ran very smoothly, and all the new hires scored very highly on the survey they had at the end of the day. And that was a great answer to that question because I told a very specific story to them, and I gave it to them in a very streamlined format. So PAR is a great resource to use in your interviews, but also in things like cover letter writing and resume writing. You can use this statement in both of those areas as well. Another common thing I don't really go over in this class, but I do go over in my interviewing class, is the STAR method, which is very, very similar to the problem, action, result method. So definitely look into that interviewing class if you want to learn more about this topic specifically. Okay, so modernize your look. So I do like to explain this bullet point of a personal story. When I first started working at CareerLink a little over a year ago, my first week at CareerLink, I wore my grandfather's suit. Now, I had worn my grandfather's suit for years and years and years. It's a great suit. My grandfather was a funeral director. He was a very well-dressed man. And after that first week or so, I went to visit my mother, his daughter, and she asked me, all these questions. How's the new job? How are your coworkers? So on and so forth. And then she eventually got to the, what did you wear? And I told her I wore Grandpa's suit. And she said, well, why did you wear that? And I went through the whole list again, funeral director, well-dressed man, yada, yada, yada. And I asked her, well, why do you ask? And she says, well, it's old. And I kind of brushed it off. I kind of expected that. But she said, well, it's also out of style. And style was the word that really clicked for me there. Style was the important keyword in there. I did talk about so much earlier about how presentation is ever so important when it comes to an interview. And style is certainly something that we want to take note of when it comes to that presentation. So, what I'm saying with this bullet point is that your interview wardrobe that you have now, nothing wrong with it. I'm not saying that you want to dress like your XYZ teenage pop star, not at all. But even if it's been 3 years since you last, upgraded your interview wardrobe or used it, you want to look out for that, because maybe in my case, maybe I didn't get some jobs because they saw this old suit on me and they didn't really think I was up to snuff for that job there. Maybe they had a differing meaning in their head about what I could do for them. So definitely think about that in a lot of detail when it comes to all those stylistic choices you have when it comes to your interview wardrobe. So I did mention I would get back to these different forms of interviewing, and I did want to get back to them here. And you see the tagline up there says body language. You may be asking yourself, well, Nick, a phone interview, you can't even see the other person. How does body language matter? And it matters in the inflection of your voice. You want to make sure that when you're on a phone interview or a Skype interview or a record interview, that you're always treating it like the person who's right there in front of you. Because if you can see by that list there, in each interview, the interview part did not change. Only the medium of communication has changed. So you want to have a phone interview at a desk, not, lounging on your couch or leaning back, at a desk where you're, have your resume in front of you. You're dressed up for the interview. That may sound silly, but it's going to give the inflection of your voice a more professional tone. And you really want to make sure with all these kind of interviews that idea is the same. If you get dressed up for a job interview where you're going to meet a person, why not for a phone interview? It should be the same exact way, because that will make your body language adjust itself, because you're going to put yourself in that professional way of thinking. And so you really want to take note of that. And again, I can't emphasize this statement enough. The interview part has not changed. Only the medium of communication. That's the thing that changed. And lastly, make sure you send a thank you note through email within 24 hours. A lot of people might say send a thank you note, by snail mail or anything of that nature. Really, a most preferred method by almost all employers is email. So make sure it is done within 24 hours of the interview. If you're not sure how to write one, the Mature Worker Packet has a guideline and example in there as well, as I don't really go over it in this class specifically. Okay. This is something that I did in my job search that helped me out, that I always like to convey to people. When I was job searching for that 9-month period, while I was working part-time, doing odd jobs here and there, my full-time job was still finding a full-time job. And I wasn't really treating it with as much focus as I did in those latter months of that, I should say. And so what you want to do is create a home office area for yourself, whatever that office area is going to look like. Have a desk there, have a computer there or a laptop, have a phone there, everything you're going to need for your job search. And treat it like work time. Schedule your time out. You're going to wake up in the morning, you'll get ready, you'll go to your little office area and you'll job search. You won't listen to music, you're not going to watch TV, you're not going to play with your dog or your kids. You're job searching. It's that, it's that important that you want to designate time as if it's an actual job for you. You want to make sure that in some cases maybe you're even wearing, professional clothing. I know, again, it may sound a little silly to do that, but it does really put you in that mindset of this is your job right now and it's your job to find a job. And I think it's going to make your job applications much more productive. And even in that the case, the Career Resource Center is always available. Of course, right at this moment, in this moment of time, that is not the case right now. Our Resource Center, our whole site is not open currently, but maybe it is about getting out away from other parts of your house. Maybe there are more of those distractions there. So certainly look out for that. Alright, so let's take everything we learned already and apply that forward. So first, I'd like to talk about this idea of your online profile, more particularly talking about that symbol you see in the top right-hand corner of your screen, which is LinkedIn. LinkedIn, for those of you who do not know, is sort of like a professional Facebook. It's an online social media network where professionals can meet and discuss and present themselves with this tool here. And so we really want to look about getting on LinkedIn because LinkedIn is going to have a plethora of benefits to us, not only making it doubly as likely for us to get a phone call back from an employer, but also the fact that 85% of jobs are filled through networking. Think about how many times in your life that you've heard that I got this job because my cousin works there, my sister works there, my brother works there. LinkedIn is a site that's all about professional networking, a site that you definitely want to take advantage of when it gets to that. So I'm going to give some quick tips on how LinkedIn is going to work here. So some online practices you want to pay note of. First and foremost, make sure your email address is professional. Even past LinkedIn, this is extremely important. Make sure you have your name and your email address in some way, shape, or form. Because if you have to email an application or a document to an employer, they want to make sure that they know who they're talking to. So try to have your name in some way, shape, or form there. It doesn't have to be first name dot last name. It can be your first and last name together. It can be your first initial and your last name. Just have your name in there at some point. Try to avoid numbers and special characters if you can. Obviously, if you have a more generic first and last name, it might be more difficult for you, but do your best to avoid too many things that are too out of the normal or too unprofessional. And Gmail is the example in there. I would recommend using a Gmail if you don't have one already, especially if you do have anything like a Yahoo, AOL, or Hotmail account. Those accounts are generally considered unprofessional for job applications, so it's not something you want to use for a job application. On LinkedIn, you're going to make connections, which is making friends on the platform in a sense, making professional colleagues, if you will. You want to make sure these connections are quality connections and not quantity of connections. While it is important to have a vast network to reach out to, you want to make sure that you know these people or have some sort of common understanding or thing in common with these people. So make sure you do make quality connections with the people on LinkedIn, people you know, have met, or at least have some interest in meeting. With LinkedIn being a professional website, you only want to talk about those professional matters. So I did call it professional Facebook. So you think about a Facebook, for example, people might post pictures of their friends and family and things they're doing and all that fun stuff. On LinkedIn, that's not going to happen. On LinkedIn, we're posting things like our volunteer work we're doing, or education we've completed, or things we've done in our jobs or our career, articles and publications that relate to those jobs and careers. Anything that's professional, everything that's professional should be on LinkedIn. We also want to try to go on LinkedIn every day, as that's going to make our profile much more visible to people like recruiters and hiring managers. And we want to remind ourselves that LinkedIn is for all career fields. I know that sometimes LinkedIn has this stigma to it that it's only for people who work in, business or HR or anything like that, but it really isn't the case of that. Surely it might have started out that way, but nowadays that really isn't the case. I can personally say I'm connected to a couple truck drivers, a painter, an electrician, a general laborer, warehouse employees. So it really isn't just for people who wear a suit and tie to work every day. It's for every other field out there. It's for if you're a professional in your field, LinkedIn is for you. So I won't harp on too much on LinkedIn anymore. If you did want to learn more about LinkedIn, I did record a whole nother class on it, available in the same place you found this class. So else we want to do is we want to read up on current industry trends. We want to know what's going on in our industry, whether that's through publications and articles, whether it's through industry-specific workshops in the future, or even professional organizations. Many organizations have moved to online bases nowadays to combat the current crisis. So definitely look out for some people meeting through telecommuting matters if you can. We also want to learn or brush up on new technology, so we're definitely going to have some resources out for you guys when it comes to some of these other classes here. Certainly we can't have public workshops right at the moment. We want to try to get some of these resources out to you in some way, shape, or form. There's also a number of other online resources you can do right now. For example, on the back of the Job Search for Mature Worker handout, there's a couple websites in there, such as gcflearnfree.org, that has a lot of great information relating from everything from technology to anything under the sun. So definitely look online, use those resources in that packet there, the resources on the CareerLink website, and see how much learning you can do to brush up on some of these new technologies. This also applies to any industry-specific tools and software you might use in your career. I know it may be difficult for you to get your hands on some of these industry-specific softwares, but even just going to their website and reading about them might be your next best step, just to have some sort of consistent knowledge that is remained there. Make sure you are networking. As I mentioned earlier, 85% of jobs are filled through networking, so you want to use a good portion of your job search networking with people, and LinkedIn will be a very good benefit to use in that case, to think about things in that case. And think of networking skills you can practice. Certainly, again, these organizations may not be meeting now, but Lehigh professionals, just for an example, they meet at the CareerLink every Friday. Of course, again, I can't emphasize enough, not currently, but once things go back to, we can go back to work and go back to the site there. Think about ways you can practice meeting with the people like Lehigh professionals, who are a great organization who meet weekly to talk about networking aspects when it comes to the job search. And here's a quick little slide on numbers for the age group of 55 and onward. It just really goes to show that numbers are on your side. The unemployment rate for this group is lower than the overall rate. It's a fastest growing segment. The job growth is significantly higher than the overall rate, 4.5% versus 1.7% overall. And the wage growth is very high, 6.3% increase, which is especially great to see for those skilled workers as well. So even if you're listening to all this stuff and you're still not entirely convinced, there is things on your side there. So definitely look into some of those areas as well. Okay, so we talked about a lot of different topics today. I really hoped listening to this recording helped you in some way, shape, or form. Definitely look into that handout. It's going to expand on some of the things that I talked about today, especially when it comes to things like the cover letters and thank you letters and all that fun stuff there. And again, let's get back to that last bullet point down there. Remind yourself how valuable you are and the skills that you have. Have that confidence, even if it's easier said than done, of course. But find those values and those things that you can offer to employers. Other than that, I really hope you are staying safe and healthy. As I usually like to say, keep on keeping on, everyone.